Hello and welcome to a special video slash podcast that I'm doing an interview with Topher Field, who, if you're sort of in the Australian libertarian scene, you'd probably be familiar with his face as he's been done a number of sort of libertarian videos. And he's had a new sort of change to his life, and we're going to talk about that later on, about starting a go-karting business. So Christopher, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Lee. Good to be here.
So, I mean, one of the things about sort of the Australian libertarian scene is we're all very kind of isolated, and it's not easy to sort of track how people sort of end up in the movement. So how did you sort of end up, how did you become a libertarian? Like what sort of drew you in, and how did you sort of get connected with other libertarians?
Well, I would say I probably grew up as very much a cliche conservative, more of a liberal voting family. I was told that John Howard was, the greatest ever. And, I supported the wars that he took us into. I supported the gun ban when it came out. But at the same time, I learned about the ideas of economic, not quite libertarianism, but certainly lower taxation, smaller government, less regulation. I was certainly on board all of those ideas. I joined the army, and I was in the reserves for a couple of years. I trained and had to think quite deeply about what it meant to go to war. Thankfully, never did. And at the time, that frustrated me as a kid full of testosterone, think you're the king of the world. That frustrated me as a kid. But I think, I'm certainly very, very grateful now that I was never deployed. But also, it forced me to think through a number of things and to really start to think about the why and the morality in a deeper way, I think, than when you're not in the military, and it won't be you in those sorts of situations. And that really began to shake, I guess, my faith in this idea. I mean, ultimately, conservatism and liberalism, as it's called in the US, the new version of liberalism, or progressivism really is probably the better term for it, are both based around the idea that if the government says so, then it's right. The idea that the government decides morality. And we can argue over what the government should be deciding, but ultimately it's the government that decides that. And one of the struggles that I came to as I thought about potentially going into combat was, if it's right to kill a man, then it's right whether I'm wearing a uniform or not. And if it's wrong to kill a man, then it's wrong whether I'm wearing a uniform or not. And the fact that some person with a badge told me to do it doesn't alter the morality of it. It's either right or it's wrong. And I think that little idea was kind of the beginning, or was what set me on a different path from just going down conservatism wholeheartedly. So now I'm a very odd beast, as most of libertarians are. And still, I've got to say, conflicted. I'm by no means settled at this point. I've come a long way in the last 10 years in terms of the evolution of what I believe and what I think. But I would also say I'm still evolving. I'm still learning. I'm still thinking. I'm still wrestling with certain issues and questions. There are topics that I've happily covered in my videos because I'm confident that I've reached a conclusion on those issues. There are other topics that I've avoided completely because whilst I do have an opinion on them, and I do know what I think right now, I also know that I may not yet be settled. And I don't want to go and champion a particular point of view and then look back in 3 or 4 years and go, well, I was a real goose there. So I'm still very much evolving and learning, but I certainly have come a long way towards a libertarian viewpoint. It's been really interesting because, I guess, of my personality and who I am and the circles that I move in. I move in lefty arts circles. I move in right-wing political circles. I move in libertarian political circles. The business community. I kind of have a lot of very disparate circles and groups of friends. And it's been really interesting watching those different groups try and come to terms with a libertarian. It's very confusing for them. Probably about as confusing as it is for a libertarian to become a libertarian. It's probably about how confusing it is for a lot of other people to try and grasp this concept that you don't fall along. It's the usual sorts of things that you and your viewers are very, very familiar with, that you don't fall along the usual party political lines. You don't just vote for a particular side regardless because they're the lesser of two evils, but you actually start asking questions like, why do I need to vote for evil? Difficult questions that are actually quite hard to answer. So for me, I then began a journey, and interestingly enough, given my conservative leanings as a younger guy, It was actually guns that really kind of made me think this through, because I'd supported the John Howard gun bans when they happened. I supported anything law and order, the war on drugs, all of it, the whole lot. And then one day I sat back while I was in the army and I thought, I've spent the last couple of years of my life on a regular basis surrounded by people with guns, which are on a regular enough basis loaded with live ammunition. And I feel completely comfortable with that. I'm completely fine with that. And if this was also the reality outside of the barracks and outside of the training grounds, I would still be completely comfortable with that. And I still think that these people that when they're wearing a uniform can be trusted to walk around carrying a gun, can be trusted to walk around carrying a gun when they're not in a uniform and when they're not on official duty and maybe when they're at home and maybe when they're driving down to the supermarket. And that was probably the first issue where I really broke away from the thinking that I'd been told was correct. And started to go, well, maybe John Howard was wrong. Maybe what he did actually wasn't the right thing. Maybe we're not safer. And of course, since I did a bunch of research into it, and I'm now quite firmly of the conclusion that removing guns from a given culture has a negligible impact on the overall homicide rate. And I won't go down that rabbit hole. That's a whole rabbit hole. But
just to interrupt, is that something that you found? Because I mean, libertarians often are not found in military circles. I mean, I guess if you're a libertarian, it'd be hard to imagine joining the military.
Yeah.
I suspect maybe in particularly the US, obviously where Ron Paul's been a huge influence, a lot of military people probably came out of the military, and discovered these ideas.
Yeah.
Like, are those sorts of libertarian conclusions something you saw amongst your peers when you're in the military? Did they have that same sort of thinking, or were they pretty anti-guns even though they carried guns for a living or for part of their living?
On guns specifically, no, they weren't anti-gun at all. They quite enjoyed playing with them, as I did. I used to joke with people that it was the best kind of tax return. I pay my taxes, they give me bullets. It's it works out quite well. But no, what's really interesting, and I think this is something worth understanding for anyone who's never been in any kind of a uniform, the sense of righteousness and the sense of one rule for them and a different rule for us, and I'm okay with that idea. That gets drilled into you when you wear a uniform, when you carry a badge, when you have any of these kinds of official positions. It's not remarkable that people in uniform think they're special. It's remarkable anytime you come across one that doesn't. Anytime you come across someone that's in uniform and thinks that they have to play by the same rules as the rest of us, because the training, I hesitate to use the word brainwashing because it carries so much baggage, but that's ultimately what it comes down to. It's they steep you in this way of thinking. That's the storm that we were talking about earlier, Lee. You can probably hear that coming through now.
I definitely do.
We've got a ripper of, it's for those that didn't hear the preamble, we've got a ripper of a storm going on down here in Melbourne right now, and for reasons I won't go into, I'm on the balcony of my house, so we've got rain and lightning and everything else going on. I apologise. Let me know if you can't hear me, Lee.
We're totally going to hold you accountable for letting the rain.
That's
totally your
right.
fault. We're going to blame you.
Yeah, totally.
You are in Sydney. After all.
I'm holding the microphone as close as I can and yelling, so hopefully you can hear me. So for the people that were in my unit, they could, without any self-consciousness and without any embarrassment, say, no, it's completely fine for me to have guns, but you can't have them. You shouldn't have them.
Yeah. Okay.
And that, I think, is something that just carries right through people in uniform. They are told, I'm going to include myself in this, we are told that we're special. We are told that we're set apart. We've been selected. We represent a unique group within society. In the case of police, you're the thin blue line. You're what stands between civilization and anarchy, which in their view doesn't mean anarchy as you and I might understand that word to mean. And so they can, without any self-consciousness at all, say, yes, I should be allowed to carry a gun. I should be allowed to carry a military weapon, no less. But you can't be allowed to have a rusty shotgun unless you've got a really good reason, why you should have one. So, no, I definitely didn't get libertarian ideas from my peers in the army, but I will say, I think that service in the army, it has one of two effects on people. It tends to push them, in my view, more conservative, or it tends to push them more libertarian. And I would say that the ones that go libertarian are in the minority, but they're certainly a significant minority. Because I think you start to realize just how easy abuses are of government power. And you also start to realize just how human the people making these decisions are. See, any kind of statism, conservatism, progressivism, whatever ism you want to use, it is predicated on this idea that the people in power know. They know better. They know what they're doing. They have the information. They can make those decisions that you and I just aren't qualified to make. Once you start getting just that little bit closer to the decision makers, and I was a private, I was a nobody in the reserves. I don't claim to have been in any kind of position of privilege, but you get that get that little bit closer to the people that are actually calling the shots, and you start to realize they are no more qualified than you or I, and it really breaks that illusion. It is that scene behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz.
Yep.
And so that was I think really that was where it started for me. The first issue really was just having that moment of, you know what? I think I was wrong about John Howard, and I think John Howard was wrong about guns. And as dumb as that is, that I think is where it kind of broke for me and where it started. And I tell a lot of people, and some people are probably sick of hearing it, but I talk about the fact that getting someone to agree with you is relatively easy. The hard part is getting them to stop believing whatever it was that they already believed in the first place.
Yeah, for sure.
I liken it to going and collecting mussels off a pier. You know, you can drive for hours down to the coast, go to a pier with a bucket in your hand. The drive back home with a bucket full of mussels is relatively easy. Cracking that damn thing off the pier, that's the hard bit. You're in there with a knife trying to jimmy the damn thing off. And that's what people's minds are like. And I saw my role really in the videos, and as I moved further into libertarianism and I decided I wanted to start to talk about this stuff and communicate some of this stuff, my role in the communications, if I can put it in a communication strategy point of view, my role wasn't to bring them all the way to where I was. My role was to crack them off the pier. Use a bit of humor, use a bit of mockery, have them walk away from the video going, yeah, the guy's a bit of a dick. But he was right about that, you know, and they've had a bit of a laugh and they've had a bit of a, you know, whatever their emotional reaction to it's going to be. But they can see some little point. There's something in what they saw that makes them go, yeah, he made a good point on that one. But the rest was rubbish. I wouldn't, the guy's a nut job. He's a libertarian. He's a whatever they want to call me. My job was to crack people off the pier, crack the muscle off the pier. How successful I was in that, well, that's for other people to decide. But and I think that kind of strategic decision came out of that experience where I progressed very quickly after I had that initial moment of, you know what I currently believe about how the world should work isn't actually correct. And once I had that moment, everything else happened quite quickly from there.
So for you, I mean, what were some of those influences that cracked the muscle off the pier? You know, like, I mean, it's... Yeah, I mean, I guess like one of the interesting things about libertarians is there's always usually quite a diverse range of things. Like sometimes it is non-libertarian thinking. Like you just hear this thing and you respond to it. You're like, well, that can't be right. And sometimes it's hearing, you know, Rand and Ron Paul and, you know, all these kinds of people. So like who for you were the key thinkers in kind of changing your mindset?
There weren't. I didn't read books. I didn't do any of the things that the typical libertarian nerd is supposed to do. And in the end, I actually made a decision to kind of keep it that way. And it shows in my videos. I'm not a deep thinker in libertarian issues, and I don't claim to be. My realization was that I needed to, if I'm going to change someone's thinking, if I'm going to get them off the pier, so to speak, I've got to go to the pier first. And I can't do that if I'm loaded up with all kinds of philosophy and all kinds of, I guess, depth of thought, because that's not where most people are at. Where most people are at is the issue of the moment, or tell me a funny joke, or let's go down to the pub and have a beer. That's where most people are actually at. And if I come at them and say, well, yes, but Murray Rothbard, you know, said, oh, yes, but have you heard about Ayn Rand? Well, I'm sorry, you're not going to get very far, you know. So for me, that I didn't come into it through the thinkers, and I still do not consider myself to be a particularly deep thinker in any of these philosophical areas. I think of myself as a retailer. I don't create the products. I don't create the ideas. I just kind of package them up and make them pretty and sell them to people.
Yeah. Sure.
So no, there aren't really any influencers that I would credit with that change for me. What did it for me was seeing behind that curtain, seeing for myself that these people that you are effectively idolizing, you are worshipping the idea of government, and you are worshipping the people in government when you give them the power over other human beings that you would never, well, that frankly no human being should have. I mean, it really is a godlike position that we put the state into. And then when you actually see up close and personal, these people do not deserve this kind of power. That was very much what did it for me. I'm just scanning through my mind now to think whether there were any early books, whether there were any early influences. And honestly, I think a lot of it, I might be doing someone a disservice here by not mentioning them, but I cannot think of any book, any YouTuber, anyone that was really a significant influence on me at that time. I just got really cranky and I started making videos for what to me seemed like common sense. And then you know what it would be? After I'd made a number of videos, Tim Andrews from the Australian Taxpayers Alliance reached out to me, having come across some of the videos that I made about the Victorian water crisis, the drought that we were having back then, and the government policies around desalination plants and other just nuts stuff. And I guess my libertarian tendencies, which at that time were not well developed, must have been showing through enough that he reached out to me and we struck up a bit of a friendship. And to be honest, it would be through him, through the people that I've met and the content that I've been introduced to since then via Tim Andrews and the Australian Taxpayers Alliance that would actually have sort of formed my thinking ever since. So I guess libertarianism reached out to me. Tim Andrews was the evangelist. I was on a journey in that direction already, but as I think about it, I don't think I really knew where I was going or what it was. I just knew that I wasn't happy with the status quo, and I no longer trusted government to be able to make my life decisions for me. That's probably the best that I can articulate it at the moment.
Okay, no, I mean it's fair enough. It's interesting that that was your journey, because I mean I guess a lot of libertarians you know have a university background of some sort, and you're probably a bit unusual.
I'm the most uneducated man you've ever met.
I wouldn't go so far to say that. I've met some pretty uneducated people, even at university. So
well,
I wouldn't be too hard. But like, what I find interesting about libertarianism, there's kind of a central kind of logic to it, and it's sort of you can't, once you sort of embrace that skepticism, and there's sort of just this logical kind of progression that if you sort of embrace the sort of a consistent way of thinking, you kind of end up at these libertarian conclusions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that for someone like yourself who's kind of on your own, you still kind of came to this position, which even for a lot of us who have actually formally or informally sort of studied these ideas, you know, we share conclusions. So that's the interesting kind of part.
And for me, probably the hardest one to get over my conservatism on would be the drug issue. You know, for me, you know, in my own family, so my dad was a pastor, we're a religious family. I'm a Christian to this day. And there's Christianity, but then there's also the cultural aspects that come with that. And I was deeply inculcated in both. And separating them has been an interesting journey in its own right, and that's another conversation. But being anti-drugs and seeing drugs as evil was an inherent part of that upbringing. And to be honest, I'm still pretty down on drugs. I still think they're a really bad idea. I just think that if you think they're a good idea, then I don't have the right to stop you from thinking they're a good idea and playing with them as you see fit. That's the difference. I still describe myself as personally very conservative. In the choices that I make for myself, I tend heavily conservative, but I don't try and use politics to force those decisions on other people, and that's what defines a political conservative versus more of a libertarian. The drug issue really, I read articles about how different places had decriminalized drugs and crime had gone down, and there was a deep cynicism in me. There was a deep skepticism that was working. They're fiddling with the numbers. It's a short-term effect. It'll bounce back the other way. It'll whatever. There was always that expectation. And I don't remember what it was that really kind of broke me on that issue. But I suspected that it was just that overwhelming shift that was happening in me. And no, you know what? I do know what it was. It was starting to realize the damage that was being done, the money that was being spent on the war on drugs. That really began when I started to think about the alternative to, you know, the moment you say, no, you can't have that plant, What does that mean in terms of government power and so forth? I'm remembering the thought process as I talk about it. So it really was just recognizing that the moment you give the government power to actually make a decision like that, you are giving them power to kick your door down. You're giving them the power to shoot you dead if they suspect that you might have been armed. And that's an inherent part of that decision to allow them to regulate a plant. So that was the journey with that particular one. But I think that was probably the hardest one for me to let go. And to say, yes, even on the issue of illegal drugs, the government is not the answer.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up because I'm a conservative Christian as well. Even just this last weekend, my pastor got up and made a comment about gambling being a sin. Now, I don't gamble. I think it's not a great idea, particularly when it comes to like lotteries. But I was like, well, where does the Bible say that? And he's like, well, I can't point to a verse. And I think the cultural thing you're talking about is very, very much ingrained.
Yeah.
And it comes into a lot of aspects, drugs, gambling. Also, I think same-sex marriage is a big part of it as well, where it's, a cultural aversion to homosexuality kind of infects the political thinking about Christians. So it's a tricky one. And I think, for me, it was, I think I saw a video by Julie Borowski, who I think is a Christian as well, who said,
I'm not sure.
There's a difference between, I'm not sure. It's certainly she's conservative.
Conservative,
anyway.
definitely, yeah.
Like where she said, like there's a difference between approving of something and making something illegal. And I think for a lot of Christians, that those two things are the same thing. Like for it to be disapproved of, it has to be illegal. And if you legalize it, therefore you're approving of it. And I think, that's the summary in some ways of their argument during the same-sex marriage debate.
Well, let me suggest a slightly different phrasing. There's a difference between disapproving of something and approving of the use of force to stop it. Because that's actually the choice, and the reason I'm splitting that particular hair is because I think that's what shifted me on the drugs issue. I still disapproved of drugs, but I realized I couldn't approve of the use of force to stop it. And that I think for a lot of people, if they could just realize that that's the dichotomy, that's actually the two choices that you're choosing between, a lot of people would shift very quickly in their attitudes towards things like drugs and lots of other stuff.
So you mentioned like when you sort of Tim Andrews reached out to you, that you started to being introduced to other sort of media or content or whatever. What sorts of things for you were kind of influential? Like what were the things that you heard and you were like, oh, that's really great?
Yeah, so I did end up reading a couple of books. Pretty much I guess you'd call them the libertarian classics, the likes of your John Stuart Mill on Liberty. Not so much a libertarian book, but de Tocqueville in America, and a few other bits and pieces. But also just a hell of a lot of my own reading and research, and a lot of it revolved around killing this idol of the expert or the idol of government knowing what it's doing. One of the books that just really, I won't say it shifted my thinking, but it kind of radicalized me, I guess, from being angry at what I viewed as government bullying and telling us what to do, blah, 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 to really actually wanting to put a stop to a lot of it, is a book that if you read it, you would be like, really? That one? Okay. It's written by Professor Ainsley Kello from the University of Tasmania. And I don't remember the title of the book, but I remember the subtitle, which was the Virtuous Corruption of Virtual Environmental Sciences. And what it was an academic book that he had written where he looked into the way that computer models and virtual environmental science had completely distorted our understanding of what was happening in the world. And his particular focus was on things like deforestation and the eradication of species and so forth. And, so for example, one of the things that he pulled out of that was to talk about the fact that in terms of the species that we are measuring going into extinction, it amounts to a few per year. But if you then take off the number of species that we thought were extinct, but we actually stumble upon and discover weren't extinct, it actually just about zeroes itself out. We're as a species, or as a planet, as a biosphere, Earth is losing very, very few species to extinction in the modern era. But if you listen to Greenpeace, if you listen to a bunch of these other organizations that make money out of scaring people, we are causing extinctions on a massive scale. Now, how do they justify that when we're not observing it? Well, they justify it by a series of formulas that are each individually very, very tenuous, and the link between them is even more tenuous. And when you kind of go through the maths, and he does in detail, I'm not going to try and go through what he goes through, but Professor Ainsley Kello of the University of Tasmania, the book subtitle is The Virtuous Corruption of the Virtual Environmental Sciences. Anyone who is as geeky as I am, I would encourage to get it and have a read. He's going to notice a spike in sales. He probably hasn't sold a copy in 5 years.
Yeah, for sure.
I've probably bought the last copy that he sold. He's going to get this spike in sales. He's going to be like, what the world's going on? But what that really did, and I've had a kind of a catchphrase since then, that I want to see the numbers behind the numbers. Because what it did for me was realize just the degree to which people were manipulating data in order to get the result that they wanted, and that they were doing it with the approval of their own conscience. And that's what he means with the virtuous corruption part of his subtitle. Virtuous corruption is a concept well understood, for example, in law enforcement, where, let's say, a prosecutor who is absolutely certain that the person he's prosecuting is definitely guilty of a hideous crime, but he doesn't have the evidence to prove it. So he fabricates a little bit of evidence, becomes fraudulent and a criminal in his own right, but does it for virtuous reasons. He's corrupt, but he's in his own mind, at the very least, he is virtuously corrupt. And that this is happening across the environmental sciences, it's happening across the medical world, it's happening across all sorts of different areas where people are coming into their profession with a certain view of the world and a certain expectation, a certain set of ideas about what's happening in the world, and they set about trying to prove them. And when they fail to prove them, they go to ever more desperate measures, which these days means going to computer models instead of observations, to be able to then say, see, this is what's happening in the world. And they can present a picture that matches their preconceived ideas. They are engaged in virtuous corruption. And we see that across environmental sciences. We see that especially in the climate change debate. People have kind of mockingly sort of said to me, oh, so you think the whole thing's a fraud? You know, do you think that there's a couple of scientists out there that are trying to fool the world? No, there's a couple of scientists out there that have fooled themselves. They mean every word. They believe it. That's the terrifying bit. That they are actually able to sit there and with a straight face and with absolute conviction say things that fly in the face of all of our measurements. And yet, because a computer model spat out the number they were looking for, so this book really shattered what was left of my faith in, I guess, the cult of experts to be able to tell us what to do and how to live. And then I went on and I looked at what had happened throughout the history the recent history of the nutritional sort of sciences. And first they said you can't eat, fat wasn't the first one, but it became fat, and there was this craze against fat. And now we're eating a lot more sugar because they put sugar into things to replace the fat, and now we've got a problem with sugar, and now they're telling us it's sugar. The number of eggs that you can eat every day, it's going to ruin your cholesterol. Well, mate, we're now discovering that cholesterol actually doesn't work in any way the way that we thought it did, blah, blah, blah. There's this long list of things, and this is in the modern era. This is with all of our modern technology. Yep. This is with all of the built-up knowledge. I'm not reaching back 2,000 years to find when the experts were wrong. You go back 5 years, and we're now discovering we were completely wrong about things. And I have no problem with people being wrong. I'm an expert at it. I've done it many times myself. I have no problem with the idea of people being wrong. I have no problem with the idea of people publishing the latest research, even though it may turn out to be wrong. It's just the best of our understanding at the moment, and they publish it, and it can be critiqued and peer-reviewed and all those processes. I have no problem even with the press picking up some latest and greatest article and making some big splash out of it, because that's how they sell newspapers. That's all well and good in my view, but the moment a bureaucrat or a public health nanny picks up that piece of so-called evidence and decides to make it a rule that applies whether we like it or not to all of us, now I have a problem. And so that journey, talking to Professor Kello and talking to a few others, some people who had formerly been in the intelligence community, some people who did extensive work on China, extensive work in the Middle East to do with the weapons of mass destruction, Saddam Hussein side of things, just getting a bit of a peek behind all of these different curtains and just realizing that there's no substance to any of these things. I think I kind of radicalized as a libertarian. I got radical about my view that I should be left alone, and that you should be left alone too.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring that up, because like it reminds me that probably one of the best quotes in all of English anything, which is C.S. Lewis, where he talks about, the tyranny exercised for the good of those is the most oppressive. And there's this great line. He says, "The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated, but those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience." And I think that's so critical to it. I mean, really the whole public choice view of the world, which is like we need to take seriously the nature of people, that people are people. There's not this expert class who are made from something better and someone, they're just regular people. So it's
I want to be a little bit controversial, and I mean, I know that you hate that sort of thing, so I'll be mild. Don't worry.
We never controversial here.
What really interests me, the further I got down sort of the libertarian rabbit hole, the more cohesive it became, and the more I started to realize that I was ultimately bringing my political decisions back to kind of a very small number of underlying principles. And that began to contrast very strongly against conservatives and progressives and what have you, where when you start to look at the things they believe on different issues side by side, the level of contradiction can be extraordinary. And to take a fairly recent example, in Victoria right now, we've just passed through the Senate, I'm not sure if it's gone through the House or not, assisted dying euthanasia legislation, where they're saying people have the right to die if they want to kill themselves. And they put all there's restrictions on it, and there's this and there's that. But ultimately what they're saying is people have the right to kill themselves and to shorten their life if that's what they so wish. So if someone wants to get an injection to shorten their life, they have the wholehearted approval of all of the liberals. But if I want to smoke a cigarette that's likely to shorten my life, then they will have a meltdown. And you start to say, well, okay, what's the principle behind this one? And is there a consistency of principle across to this other position that you have over here? And there isn't. Every single different position they take is based on a whole different argument and a whole different area. And they've had to kind of fragment and segment their thinking in order to make each one appear reasonable on its own. And what I found with libertarianism was my own internal contradiction started to disappear a little bit. My own internal set, I found that as a conservative, of course, I had the same thing going on. I'm not just saying that that's unique to one side of politics. That's any side of politics that wants to use the force of government to make people do as they're told, and yet also claims to believe in freedom in some other area, has chronic internal contradictions in what they believe. And I found those kind of disappearing as I went further down the libertarian rabbit hole. And I found that really satisfying. I found it really empowering to kind of start going, you know what? Anytime someone asks me a policy question, anytime someone throws one of those difficult hypothetical conundrums that people love to throw at you when you're talking politics, you boil it down to the basic principles, and I actually have an answer. I'm not tying myself up in knots. And so I just find libertarianism is just one of the most satisfying, internally consistent, internally resolved political philosophies that I've come across.
Sorry, I just got a bit delayed there. It seems that the weather's playing havoc with your internet.
Possibly.
Well, let's. I mean, I think I can't really say it any better than what you just said. Then